He looked at his pregnant wife, clutching their sobbing son in her arms, and spoke 5 words that would unravel his entire world. Take the boy and leave. He thought he was shedding a weakness. He thought he was upgrading his life. But he had no idea that the tear-streaked woman huddled on his doorstep had just inherited a $2.5 billion empire from a grandfather she never knew. He cast her out into the storm, unaware that in days, she wouldn't just be his ex-wife. She'd be the invisible force owning his career, his ambitions, and his downfall. This is the story of ultimate reckoning. The rain in the upscale suburb didn't just pour. It lashed against the manicured lawn like 1,000 accusations. Inside the grand entryway, the air was thick with the scent of polished marble and betrayal. Lindsey adjusted her grip on Daniel, her swollen belly pressing against her olive coat, every movement a reminder of the life growing inside her. She had called Albert from the doctor's office. Earlier, her voice steady despite the exhaustion. No answer. She had texted that she and Daniel were heading home after his playdate. No reply. "Lindsey," Albert said from the doorway, his voice as crisp as his navy suit. She pushed through the front door, shaking droplets from her hair, Daniel whining softly against her shoulder. "Albert, it's pouring out there. Daniel's soaked already." The foyer felt off. Too pristine, the usual scatter of toys and mail vanished. And then she saw her, Rose, poised like a statue in her form-fitting red gown, blonde hair flawless, arm linked with Albert's. That's when Lindsey noticed the suitcase, packed and waiting by the threshold like a final verdict. Albert met her eyes, his expression a wall of cold resolve. He took a measured breath, glancing at Rose before turning back. "We're done, Lindsey," he said, his tone devoid of warmth. "Take the boy and leave." Lindsey froze, her hand tightening around Daniel's as the child burst into tears. She looked down at her son, his little face crumpled in confusion, then back at the man she had married, the man who had no clue what power she now held. The rain came down in sheets, turning the grand circular driveway into a mirror of shattered lights. Lindsey Porter stumbled through the front door, one arm wrapped protectively around 4-year-old Daniel, the other clutching the handle of the small rolling suitcase Albert had packed for her. Water streamed from her dark hair, plastering it to her cheeks, and her olive coat hung heavy, soaked through in seconds. Daniel's sobs were muffled against her neck, his little body shaking from cold and confusion. Inside the foyer, the chandelier blazed like an accusation. Albert stood beneath it in his tailored navy suit, arms folded, jaw set. Beside him, Rose leaned against the doorframe in a crimson gown that looked poured onto her body, elegant, dry, triumphant. Her blonde waves were perfect, her makeup untouched by the storm. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her presence was the punctuation mark on everything Albert was about to say. Lindsey's breath came in shallow bursts. The baby inside her shifted, a firm kick against her ribs as if protesting the chaos. She had spent the afternoon at Daniel's preschool holiday program, clapping while he sang off-key about reindeer. She had texted Albert a photo, Daniel in his tiny elf hat, grinning gap-toothed at the camera. No reply. She had assumed he was in meetings. She had assumed wrong. "Albert," she said, voice hoarse from the cold air. "It's pouring. Daniel's freezing. Whatever this is, can we talk inside?" Albert's eyes flicked to the boy, then away, as if looking too long might weaken his resolve. "There's nothing to talk about, Lindsey. I've made my decision." Daniel lifted his head, tears cutting clean tracks through the rain on his cheeks. "Daddy, why is Rosie here?" Rose offered the child a small, sympathetic smile that never reached her eyes. Albert didn't answer his son. Lindsey shifted Daniel's weight, her lower back aching. 8 months pregnant, she felt every pound of him. "You packed my things," she said quietly, nodding toward the suitcase. It was the same one they'd taken on their honeymoon. Scuffed now, smaller than she remembered. "How long have you been planning this?" "Long enough to know it's right." Albert's tone was clipped, professional, the same voice he used in boardrooms. "You and I want different things. I'm moving forward. You're not part of that anymore." The words landed like slaps. Lindsey felt heat rise in her face despite the cold soaking her bones. She had supported him through business school, through the late nights, the moves, the years of climbing. She had left her own career dreams on hold. She had carried his children, and now she was not part of that anymore. Rose finally spoke, her voice smooth as silk. "It's better this way, darling. Clean break." Lindsey looked at her, at the hand Rose rested possessively on Albert's forearm, and felt something inside her chest harden, like ice forming over moving water. Daniel began to cry harder. "I want to go inside, Mommy. I'm cold." Albert stepped forward, reaching for the door. "Take the boy and leave," he said. The same 5 words he'd spoken moments earlier, now delivered with finality. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Lindsey stared at him, searching for the man who had once promised forever in a little church with peeling paint. That man was gone, replaced by this stranger in an expensive suit who couldn't meet her eyes. She adjusted her grip on Daniel, pulling him closer. Rain hammered the portico roof overhead. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled. Without another word, Lindsey turned. She stepped back into the storm, pulling the suitcase behind her. The wheels rattled over wet stone. Daniel's cries grew louder, but she kept walking, down the steps, across the driveway, toward the iron gates that were already swinging open, as if the house itself wanted her gone. Behind her, the heavy front door closed with a soft, definitive thud. Lindsey didn't look back. She couldn't. If she did, she might shatter completely, and she had 2 children counting on her to stay whole. The rain swallowed them both as she reached the street, one hand on her belly, the other holding her son tight. She had no plan, no destination, only the weight of the suitcase and the fierce, quiet certainty blooming beneath her fear. Whatever came next, she would survive it. For them, she would become something Albert could never imagine. The rain showed no mercy. It drove sideways under the portico, needling Lindsey's face as she dragged the suitcase down the last step. The wheels caught on the wet stone, jerking her arm and sending a sharp cramp across her belly. She paused, breathing through it. One hand pressed low where the baby kicked in protest. Daniel's cries had turned raw, ragged things that tore at her more than the wind. "Shh, sweetheart, it's okay," she whispered against his soaked hair, though nothing was okay. His small fingers clutched the collar of her coat like it was the only solid thing left in the world. She shifted him higher, feeling the weight of him and the weight inside her, and kept moving. The gates at the end of the drive stood open, as if the house had already erased them from its memory. Beyond lay the quiet, tree-lined street where neighbors' windows glowed warm and distant. No one would come out in this weather. No one would see. Albert had chosen the night perfectly. Water sloshed inside her shoes with every step. The suitcase banged against her calf, heavier than it should have been. Albert had packed only what he deemed essential. A few changes of clothes, Daniel's favorite stuffed dinosaur, her prenatal vitamins. No jewelry, no laptop, no checkbook. He had left her purse on the entry table, deliberately out of reach. She had $63 in her coat pocket and the debit card linked to their joint account, which she knew he would freeze by morning. Daniel's sobs quieted to exhausted hiccups. "Mommy, where are we going?" "I don't know yet, baby." Her voice stayed steady, the way it did when he fell off the swings or woke from nightmares. She couldn't let it shake. Not now. Headlights swept across the puddles ahead. An Uber turning onto the street, probably summoned by Albert to make sure she actually left the property. The car slowed, window rolling down. The driver, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, took in the pregnant woman and the crying child and didn't ask questions. "Need a ride, Mom?" Lindsey nodded, throat tight. She wrestled the suitcase into the trunk while Daniel clung to her neck. Once inside, the warmth of the heater felt almost painful against her frozen skin. She gave the driver the only address she could think of, the extended stay hotel near the highway, the one with weekly rates and a 24-hour front desk. It was 20 minutes away. It would do for tonight. As the car pulled away, she allowed herself one glance back. The mansion's windows blazed gold against the dark, silhouettes moving behind the glass. Albert and Rose already celebrating. The front door was closed. The gates began to swing shut. Daniel pressed his face to the window, watching the house disappear. Daddy didn't say goodbye. Lindsey pulled him into her lap, wrapping her wet coat around them both. He's confused right now, she said softly. It was the gentlest lie she could manage. But we're going to be all right. I promise. The baby kicked again, harder this time, as if reminding her of the stakes. 2 children. No home, no plan beyond the next hour. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, an unknown number. She almost ignored it, but something made her answer. Ms. Lindsey Porter. The voice was male, older, precise. Yes, this is Marcus Ellison of Ellison, Grant & Associates. I apologize for the late hour, but I've been trying to reach you all day regarding a matter of extreme urgency and confidentiality. It concerns the estate of Mr. Harlan Whitmore. The name meant nothing to her. I think you have the wrong person. I assure you I do not. Mr. Whitmore named you primary beneficiary in his revised trust, executed 3 months ago. The reading is scheduled for tomorrow morning. Given the size of the estate, approximately $2.5 billion, I strongly advise you to attend. The words reached her slowly, muffled by rain and exhaustion and disbelief. Lindsey stared at the rivulets racing down the car window. Miss Porter, are you still there? Yes, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm here. Daniel had fallen asleep against her chest, his breath warm and even. The suitcase sat on the seat beside them, small and pathetic against the vastness of what was coming. Tomorrow, everything would change. Tonight, she held her son tighter and let the rain carry them into the dark. The hotel room smelled of stale coffee and industrial cleaner, a stark contrast to the rain-soaked street outside. Lindsey sat on the edge of the sagging bed, Daniel curled beside her under a thin blanket, his breathing soft but uneven from the night's ordeal. The suitcase sat unopened in the corner, its presence a quiet accusation. Her phone rested in her hand, the call from Marcus Ellison still echoing in her mind. $2.5 billion. The words felt like a foreign language, slipping through her grasp as she tried to make sense of them. Morning light filtered through the blinds, grey and tentative, as she dialed the number back. The line clicked after 2 rings. Ellison, Grant & Associates. This is Marcus Ellison speaking. Mr. Ellison, it's Lindsey Porter. I need to understand what you told me last night. His voice was calm, measured. Of course, Miss Porter. Mr. Harlan Whitmore was your maternal grandfather, a reclusive financier who passed away last week. He left no immediate heirs, and after extensive legal vetting, you were identified as his sole living descendant through your mother's side. The estate includes private equity firms, real estate holdings, and a controlling interest in several multinational corporations. The trust is airtight, executed 3 months ago with your name explicitly listed. Lindsey's free hand rested on her belly, the baby's movements a steady rhythm beneath her palm. I never knew him. My mother never mentioned a grandfather. That's not uncommon, Marcus said. Mr. Whitmore severed ties with his family decades ago, likely to protect his wealth from scrutiny. The will was sealed until his death, with instructions to locate you immediately. We've been searching for months. She glanced at Daniel, his face peaceful despite the chaos. And this reading, today? At 10 a.m. at our office downtown. I'll send a car. You'll need to bring identification and sign several documents to initiate the transfer. Given your circumstances, we can expedite the process. Circumstances. The word hung heavy. She thought of Albert's cold dismissal, the suitcase, the rain. Thank you, she said, her voice steadying. I'll be there. The call ended, and she sat motionless, the hum of the room's heater filling the silence. $2.5 billion. Enough to build a life, a fortress, for her children. Enough to make Albert's betrayal a footnote in a story he'd never control. At 9:30, a black sedan pulled up, its driver holding an umbrella as she carried Daniel to the car. The ride was quiet, the city waking around them, office workers hurrying, traffic lights blinking through the drizzle. Downtown, the law firm's building loomed, all glass and steel, a testament to the wealth she was about to inherit. Inside, Marcus greeted her with a firm handshake, guiding her to a conference room where a team of attorneys waited. Papers were spread across the table, the will's language dense with legalese, but the numbers were clear. 2.5 billion, plus assets Albert had bragged about managing, firms and properties she now owned. As she signed the final document, a weight lifted, replaced by a cold, calculated clarity. She was no longer the discarded wife. She was a power he couldn't fathom. Daniel tugged at her sleeve, whispering, "Mommy, are we safe now?" She smiled, brushing his hair back. "Yes, baby, we're safe." The meeting ended with Marcus handing her a temporary debit card, linked to the estate's accounts. "We'll handle the rest," he said. "You're in control now." Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the streets glistening. Lindsey stood on the sidewalk, Daniel in her arms, the card a secret in her pocket. She thought of Albert, of Rose, of the life she'd been forced to abandon. This was just the beginning. And if you've been gripped by Lindsey's journey from the storm to this turning point, why not join us? Like this story, comment with your thoughts on her next move, and subscribe to follow every twist as she rebuilds her empire. Just like Lindsey, you're part of something bigger now. Don't miss a chapter of her rise. The first week blurred into a haze of motel rooms and quiet planning. Lindsey moved them every few days, cheap places with kitchenettes, paid in cash from the temporary account Marcus had set up. She kept the curtains drawn, ordered groceries online, and spoke to no one except Daniel and the attorneys. Daniel asked for his father only once, a small broken question in the dark. She held him until he slept, her own tears silent against his hair. Marcus handled everything with ruthless efficiency. Trusts were restructured, shell companies activated, non-disclosure agreements signed by anyone who learned her name. Lindsey's identity was buried beneath layers of legal armor. To the world, the Whitmore empire remained leaderless, its boards running on autopilot, while rumors swirled about distant cousins or corporate raiders. No one looked for a pregnant woman in a suburban motel with a 4-year-old who still clutched a stuffed dinosaur. She studied the portfolio nightly on a new, untraceable laptop. Holdings in private equity, commercial real estate, venture funds. And there, threaded through it all like invisible wire, were the very institutions Albert had spent years courting. The investment bank backing his firm's biggest deals. The real estate trust that owned the building where he parked his ambition. The private equity group whose partners invited him to golf retreats. All of them quietly answering, now to her. Lindsey did not celebrate. She catalogued. She learned. She waited. By the end of the second month, the baby was due any day, and the empire was fully hers. She moved them into a gated estate 2 hours away, modest by billionaire standards, sprawling by any other. High walls, private security, staff vetted by Marcus himself. Daniel got a sunlit playroom and a nanny who read him stories in the afternoon. Lindsey got silence, space, and time. Labor came at dawn. She drove herself to a private clinic under an assumed name, delivered a healthy girl she named Eleanor, and was home within 48 hours. No announcements, no photos, no trace. Albert, meanwhile, was ascending. Headlines praised his rapid promotions. His engagement to Rose splashed across society pages. He leased a penthouse, bought a new car, spoke confidently in interviews about vision and legacy. He never mentioned the wife he'd discarded or the son whose existence he'd begun to erase from his narrative. Lindsey watched from afar, feeding instructions to Marcus in measured, unemotional calls. Acquire this block of shares. Extend that line of credit. Approve the merger, but only if certain conditions are met. Every move was small, surgical, invisible. Albert's successes arrived on schedule, each one unknowingly stamped with her approval. She began to change, not in loud ways, but in the quiet erosion of old habits. She no longer flinched at raised voices. She no longer apologized for taking up space. When Daniel spilled juice on an antique rug, she cleaned it without panic. When Elena cried at 3 a.m., she soothed her with the steady calm of someone who had already survived the worst. One evening, 6 months after the rain-soaked night, Lindsey stood at the nursery window, Elena asleep against her shoulder. Below, the estate's gardens stretched into twilight, orderly and vast. She thought of the suitcase Albert had packed. How small it had seemed then. How small he would seem soon. She was no longer the woman who had begged for answers in a marble foyer. She was the silence behind boardroom doors. The signature on documents no one questioned. The hand that could lift or crush without ever being seen. Lindsey pressed her lips to Elena's soft hair, then to Daniel's forehead as he slept in the next room. The empire was secure, the children were safe, and Albert still believed he had won. She turned off the light, the darkness settling around her like armor. The next phase would come when he forced it, when his ambition finally overreached and tried to sever the last thread connecting him to her children. She would be ready, not with screams or pleas, but with the weight of $2.5 billion and the ferocity only a mother can wield. Until then, she built her silent empire, brick by invisible brick, and waited. Albert Porter had never moved faster up the ladder. In the 18 months since he closed the door on Lindsey and Daniel, his life had become a highlight reel of triumphs. The corner office on the 42nd floor came first, then the partnership announcement, then the invitations to exclusive retreats in Aspen and the Hamptons. Industry magazines ran profiles with headlines like, "The visionary behind the billion-dollar deals." He gave quotes about grit, timing, and surrounding himself with the right people. Rose was always at his side in the photographs, elegant, smiling, the perfect accessory to his ascent. He told himself he felt nothing when colleagues asked, casually, about his family. "Personal life's private," he'd say with an easy laugh, steering the conversation back to market trends. He had signed the divorce papers months ago, unchecked boxes where Lindsey's signature should have been. She never contested, never appeared, never even hired a lawyer as far as he knew. It was as if she had evaporated, taking the boy with her. Clean, efficient, exactly how he liked things. What Albert didn't know, what no one knew, was that every rung he climbed had been quietly reinforced by Lindsey's hand. The merger that earned him his first 7-figure bonus? The deciding votes on the acquiring board came from a trust managed through a Cayman entity ultimately controlled by her. The line of credit that saved his firm during a shaky quarter. Approved by a private equity group whose majority stakeholder had changed, without fanfare, to an anonymous Whitmore holding. The luxury building where he and Rose now hosted cocktail parties for investors. Title transferred 6 months earlier to a real estate arm Lindsey had absorbed into the empire. She watched it all from a distance, through reports Marcus emailed weekly. Spreadsheets of share percentages, meeting minutes, press clippings. She read them at night after the children were asleep. Eleanor in her crib. Daniel sprawled across a bed twice his size. Dinosaur tucked under one arm. The numbers were cold, precise, satisfying. Albert's success arrived on schedule because she allowed it. She could have crushed him at any moment, pulled funding, blocked deals, leaked discrepancies. But she didn't. Not yet. There was strategy and patience. Let him rise high enough that the fall would echo. Albert began to speak of legacy. At a charity gala, champagne flute in hand, he told a cluster of admirers he wanted to build something enduring. Rose laughed beside him, fingers tracing the lapel of his tuxedo, and suggested they start a foundation. He liked the idea. Porter Family Foundation. His name in marble. He filed the paperwork, quietly routing seed money through the same investment vehicles he'd spent years courting. Lindsey saw the transfer request cross Marcus's desk. $10 million. She approved it without comment. Sometimes, late at night, she wondered if Albert ever thought of Daniel, if he remembered the boy's laugh, or the way he used to run to the door shouting, "Daddy's home," when Albert walked in from work. She wondered if guilt ever flickered across his face when he passed a playground and saw a child the same age. Then she would close the laptop, walk to Daniel's room, and watch him sleep. The wondering stopped. Guilt was a luxury Albert had forfeited the night he packed her suitcase. Rose, for her part, reveled in the new life. She redecorated the penthouse in muted golds and whites, hosted brunches for the wives of Albert's colleagues, posted carefully curated photos of European vacations. She never mentioned Lindsey. Why would she? The past had been erased. Albert's crowning moment came with an invitation to the Whitmore Forum, an ultra-exclusive gathering of the world's most influential financiers, held annually at a private estate in the Hudson Valley. Acceptance was by referral only. He received the embossed envelope on a Tuesday, opened it in his office, and felt the rush of validation he'd chased for years. Rose kissed him that night, whispering that they'd finally arrived. He had no idea the forum's guest list was curated by a committee, now answering indirectly to his discarded wife. Lindsey read the confirmation email from Marcus and allowed herself the smallest curve of a smile. Albert was stepping onto her ground, blindfolded, believing every inch of it was his own. The higher he climbed, the more he belonged to her, and soon, when the moment was perfect, she would remind him. The Whitmore Forum took place in a stone manor nestled among rolling hills, its long gravel drive lined with ancient oaks. Albert arrived in a chauffeured town car, Rose beside him in emerald silk that caught the late autumn light. Cameras flashed as they stepped onto the portico. He smiled the practiced smile of a man who believed the world was finally aligning in his favor. Inside, the air smelled of old wood, leather, and quiet money. Men and women whose names appeared only in footnotes of financial journals greeted him with firm handshakes and measured compliments. He felt the weight of arrival settle on his shoulders like a tailored coat. Lindsey watched from a distance, as she always did now. She sat in a secure study on the upper floor of her own estate, a live feed from the forum's private security system projected onto the wall. Marcus had arranged access months earlier. The manor itself was held by one of her trusts. She wore simple black, hair pulled back, Eleanor asleep in the bassinet beside her desk. Daniel was downstairs with his tutor. The room was silent except for the soft murmur of voices from the screen. The keynote luncheon took place in a paneled boardroom overlooking the valley. 28 seats around a mahogany table polished to a mirror sheen. Albert was placed near the head, a subtle signal of rising status. When the chairman, an elegant woman in her 70s named Victoria Hale, called the room to order, conversation faded like smoke. The agenda was routine at first. Market forecasts, regulatory shifts, portfolio reallocations. Then Victoria steered toward the final item. "As you know," she said, her voice carrying easily without amplification, "the Whitmore trusts have undergone a quiet transition following Harlan's passing. The new controlling beneficiary has chosen to remain anonymous for the present, but has authorized us to implement several structural changes effective immediately." Albert listened politely, assuming this was procedural housekeeping. He had no reason to think otherwise. Victoria continued, "The first change concerns leadership of the private equity division, overseeing North American operations. The current managing partner has elected to step down for personal reasons." A ripple of surprise moved through the room. The managing partner, a silver-haired titan named Charles Langford, had been untouchable for decades. "In his place," Victoria said, "the beneficiary has appointed a new chair, effective today." She paused, letting the weight settle. Albert Porter. Heads turned. Albert felt the collective gaze like spotlights. He blinked, caught off guard, then allowed a modest smile to form. Rose reached under the table and squeezed his hand. Whispers traveled the table. Congratulations. Speculation. Envy. He nodded graciously, already composing the acceptance remarks he would deliver later. Victoria wasn't finished. "There are additional adjustments," she said, sliding a slim folder across the table to the seat beside Albert. "Voting proxies for the real estate trust, the venture fund, and the investment bank consortium have been consolidated under the same controlling entity. Mr. Porter will serve as public liaison for these entities going forward, reporting directly to the beneficiary." Albert's pulse quickened. This wasn't just a promotion. This was dominion over half the deals he had spent his career chasing. He opened his mouth to express gratitude, but Victoria lifted a hand. "One final note," she said, her eyes sweeping the room before settling on him. "The beneficiary has instructed that all future strategic decisions require explicit approval through this office. No exceptions." The room absorbed the implication. Albert's new power came with an unseen leash. He nodded, masking the flicker of unease. Oversight was standard in structures this large. He would navigate it. The meeting adjourned to applause. Colleagues crowded around him with champagne flutes and promises of partnership. Rose's eyes shone with triumph. Albert accepted it all, the golden boy crowned at last. 300 miles away, Lindsey muted the feed. She leaned back in her chair, fingers steepled. The boardroom where Albert now sat at the head of the table belonged to her. The votes that had elevated him had been cast by her. The leash Victoria had so delicately referenced was held firmly in her hand. Marcus's voice came through the speakerphone. He took the bait, cleanly. No questions about the beneficiary's identity. "Good," Lindsey said. Her voice was quiet, almost gentle. Let him enjoy the view from the top for a while. She ended the call and turned to the bassinet. Elena stirred, tiny fists waving. Lindsey lifted her daughter, pressing a kiss to her forehead. Power had changed hands that afternoon, silently and irrevocably. Albert simply hadn't realized whose hands now held it. Rose believed she had won. She moved through the penthouse like a queen, surveying newly conquered territory. The space had been hers to shape from the beginning. Ivory marble floors, gold-veined walls, crystal chandeliers that caught the city lights and threw them back in glittering defiance. She hosted brunches where the wives of Albert's colleagues complimented her taste, her poise, her effortless elegance. She wore the emerald ring Albert had given her on their engagement trip to Capri, twisting it absently while she scrolled through social media mentions of the Porter Power couple. Every photograph captured her at his side, blonde hair catching the sun, smile calibrated to perfection. The past, Lindsey, the rain, the crying child, had been erased so thoroughly that Rose sometimes forgot it had ever existed. She planned their future with the confidence of someone who had never been denied. A summer house in the Hamptons, private school applications for the children they would have, a foundation bearing Albert's name, with her as co-chair. She spoke of these things in soft, certain tones over breakfast, and Albert nodded, distracted but pleased. His new role at the Whitmore Forum had brought prestige, invitations, and a salary that made the old one seem like pocket change. Rose took credit in small, subtle ways. Her introductions at galas, her carefully curated guest lists, the way she steered conversations toward deals that later landed on his desk. She believed she had built this life brick by gleaming brick. Albert let her believe it. He had never been one for introspection. Success felt like his natural state, and the invisible strings that now controlled his trajectory were too fine to notice. When funding flowed effortlessly, when competitors dropped out at the last minute, when boards voted his way without debate, he attributed it to his own brilliance. Rose's pride only reinforced the illusion. She kissed him goodnight with the satisfaction of a woman who had chosen well, who had traded up from whatever came before. She never asked about the anonymous beneficiary. Why would she? The structure was opaque by design, and Albert dismissed questions with a wave. "It's just how these old trusts work," he said. "Layers of lawyers and faceless money." Rose accepted it. She preferred faceless money to a face she might have to acknowledge. One crisp October evening, she hosted a dinner for 12 in the penthouse dining room. Crystal stemware rang against silver. Laughter floated above the low hum of conversation. Albert sat at the head, Rose at his right, her hand resting lightly on his forearm as she told a story about their trip to Santorini. The guests, partners, investors, a senator with presidential ambitions, leaned in, charmed. Rose felt the warmth of victory in her chest, solid and bright. Across the city, in a quiet estate where the children slept under soft blankets, Lindsey received the weekly report from Marcus. Photographs from the dinner had already circulated online, Rose radiant, Albert triumphant. Lindsey studied them without emotion, noting the ring, the smile, the way Rose's fingers claimed space on Albert's sleeve. She closed the file. Rose's illusion was perfect because Lindsey allowed it to be. Every compliment, every invitation, every moment of certainty Rose felt was purchased with Lindsey's silence. The Empire funded the penthouse, the trips, the foundation. The Empire approved the deals that kept Albert rising. The Empire let Rose play queen in a castle built on ground that could shift at any moment. Lindsey did not rush. She had learned that true power did not need to announce itself. It simply waited. In the nursery down the hall, Eleanor stirred and Lindsey went to her, lifting the baby into her arms. The child settled against her shoulder with a small sigh. Down the corridor, Daniel's door stood ajar, a nightlight casting gentle stars across the ceiling. Lindsey paused outside his room, watching him sleep, the dinosaur tucked under his chin. Rose might have the penthouse and the photographs, but Lindsey had the children, the silence, and the knowledge that every breath Rose took in victory was drawn with Lindsey's permission. When the illusion finally cracked, it would not be loud. It would be surgical, and Rose would learn, too late, that the throne she sat on had never truly belonged to her. The papers arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by courier to Lindsey's gated estate. Thick cream envelopes sealed with red wax, the kind that announced intent before a single page was turned. Marcus called first, his voice stripped of its usual calm. He's filing for sole custody of Daniel, and a paternity challenge. He claims you concealed the boy's origins and demands a DNA test to terminate his rights entirely. Lindsey stood in the sunlit kitchen, coffee cooling untouched in her hand. Elena babbled in her high chair, smearing banana across the tray. Daniel was at the table coloring a dinosaur purple. The ordinary morning cracked open like thin ice. She opened the envelope after the children were settled with the nanny. The petition was clinical, vicious. Albert alleged instability, abandonment of marital home, questionable parentage. He painted Lindsey as erratic, rootless, a woman who had vanished rather than fight for her family. He sought to erase his name from Daniel's birth certificate, to sever support obligations, to ensure Rose's future children would never share an inheritance with the child of uncertain lineage. The insult was surgical, not just to her, but to the boy who still asked, occasionally, why Daddy didn't visit anymore. Lindsey did not cry. She read every line twice, then forwarded the documents to Marcus with a single instruction: proceed. Albert's timing was deliberate. His star had never burned brighter. Tabloid profiles called him untouchable. A paternity scandal would be framed as noble, clearing the path for his new family, protecting his legacy. Public sympathy would lean toward the successful man burdened by a shadowy past. He underestimated the woman he had discarded. The first move came quietly. Lindsey's legal team, assembled from the finest firms the empire could retain, filed a restrained response. No counter-accusations, no media leaks, simply a request for expedited discovery and a sworn financial disclosure from Albert, given his petition's implications for child support. Albert's attorneys bristled. Disclosure was routine in custody cases, but Albert had grown accustomed to opacity. His wealth was layered through bonuses, offshore accounts, gifts from Rose's family. Untangling it would take time. Lindsey gave them none. Within weeks, anonymous tips reached financial reporters, whispers of irregularities in Albert's expense reports, questions about funding sources for the Porter Family Foundation. Subpoenas followed. Board members at his firms received notices to preserve documents. The paternity test he demanded was granted, results sealed, delivered only to the court. But the surrounding noise grew louder. Rose felt the shift first. Invitations dried up. Brunch conversations turned awkward. A society columnist hinted at complications in the Porter household. Rose confronted Albert in the penthouse one evening, voice sharp. "Fix this. You said it would be clean." Albert promised he would. He doubled legal fees, hired crisis PR, but every step he took seemed to sink him deeper. Deals stalled. Partners grew distant. The anonymous beneficiary, whose approval he now needed for major decisions, began routing requests through endless reviews. Lindsey watched the erosion from her study, reports arriving daily. She never raised her voice in court. She appeared once, composed in navy, Daniel's small hand in hers as they entered the family courthouse through a side door. Photographers caught only a glimpse. Headlines the next day read, "Mystery ex-wife surfaces in Porter paternity battle." The judge ordered mediation. In a sterile conference room, Albert finally saw her again. Lindsey sat across the table, posture straight, eyes steady. Daniel was not present, Elena waited with the nanny outside. Albert looked older, strain etched around his mouth. Rose was absent, advised against attending. He spoke first, voice low. "Let's end this sensibly. Sign away rights, and I'll provide a settlement." Lindsey's attorney slid a folder forward. Inside, bank records, emails, transfers. Evidence that Albert's recent wealth traced directly to entities now controlled by the Whitmore Trust. Evidence that every promotion, every deal had been facilitated by the woman he sought to erase. Albert's face drained of color. Lindsey spoke for the first time. Her voice was quiet, almost conversational. "You wanted a war, Albert. You declared Daniel illegitimate to protect your new life. Now the court will see exactly whose life was built on my inheritance." She stood. "We'll see you at trial." Outside, she buckled Daniel into the car, kissed his forehead, and drove home through trees heavy with late autumn gold. The war had entered its final phase. Albert's illusion of control was fracturing, and Lindsey, silent until now, had finally begun to move. The courtroom was smaller than Albert expected, paneled in dark wood that absorbed sound and light. He sat rigid in his tailored suit, Rose beside him for the first time in weeks, her hand no longer reaching for his. The gallery held only a handful of reporters, barred from cameras, notebooks poised like weapons. Lindsey entered last, composed in charcoal gray, hair swept back, no jewelry except a simple watch. Daniel and Eleanor waited miles away, safe behind gates and guards. The judge, a woman with sharp eyes and no patience for theater, called the case. Evidence had been submitted in chambers. Arguments distilled to essentials. Albert's team pushed for dismissal of financial ties, claiming coincidence. Lindsey's attorneys laid out the chain. Trusts, holdings, approvals, every milestone of Albert's rise traceable to decisions she had authorized. When the DNA results were unsealed, the room barely stirred. Paternity confirmed. Daniel was his, indisputably. Albert's gamble to sever the tie had collapsed under its own weight. The judge ruled swiftly. Sole custody to Lindsey. Supervised visitation for Albert, contingent on counseling and support payments recalculated against his true assets. Then came the civil finding, fraudulent concealment of marital assets during divorce proceedings. The Whitmore empire's reach was laid bare, not as coincidence, but as inheritance Lindsey had shielded until provoked. Sanctions followed, licenses suspended, boards convened emergency sessions. The anonymous beneficiary's directive circulated quietly that afternoon. Albert Porter was to be removed from all leadership roles, effective immediately. Contracts voided, partnerships dissolved. The foundation bearing his name frozen pending audit. By evening, headlines shifted from scandal to ruin. Albert Porter, once the golden financier, exposed as beneficiary of an ex-wife's hidden fortune, one he had attempted to discredit. Stock in his flagship deals dipped. Investors pulled commitments. Rose's phone went silent. Her social accounts pruned followers. Overnight, Albert returned to the penthouse alone. Lights off, city glittering coldly beyond the windows. He poured a drink, then another, staring at the life he had curated, now unraveling thread by thread. Rose's suitcases, newer, larger than the one he had once packed for Lindsey, stood by the door when he woke the next morning. A note in her elegant script, "I can't weather this storm." He did not contest her departure. Lindsey received the final decree in her study, markers on speaker confirming the restructures. Every entity Albert had touched was scrubbed of his influence, shares redistributed, positions filled by quieter, more reliable stewards. The empire emerged stronger, its controlling hand still unseen. She signed one last document that week, a trust amendment placing the bulk of the estate into irrevocable funds for Daniel and Elena, layered protections ensuring no future claim could ever reach them. A smaller educational trust was established anonymously for children of single mothers, quiet, ongoing, no name attached. Years later, Daniel asked once about his father. Lindsey answered honestly but briefly. "He made choices that took him far from us. We made different ones." Daniel nodded, accepting, and returned to his sketchbook. Eleanor never asked at all. Albert faded into obscurity. A mid-level consulting role under a name few recognized. Occasional sightings in airport lounges. Alone, eyes down. The man who had sought legacy became a cautionary footnote in boardroom conversations. Ambition unchecked, gratitude absent. Lindsey never spoke of him again. She built schools in underserved districts, funded medical research, sat on boards under her own name now, calm and unassailable. She attended Daniel's school plays and Eleanor's recitals, coached soccer on weekends, read bedtime stories in voices that made dinosaurs roar and princesses laugh. The rain-soaked night, the suitcase, the closed door, they became origin, not burden. A mother had been discarded, and from that discarding rose an empire dedicated not to revenge, but to endurance. She had not screamed. She had not begged. She had waited, protected, and when the moment came, she erased him, not with noise, but with the quiet, irreversible weight of absolute power wielded for her children. The storm had passed long ago. In its wake stood a legacy no one could touch.